Some fugitives run because they're afraid, some because they're cornered. But the most disturbing ones, the ones who vanish with a smile, with cash in hand and not a trace of regret, they don't run because they're desperate. They run because they've been planning to disappear all along. These are the ghosts that stay in our system for decades, the ones who kill with calmness, lie with charm, and somehow slip through every dragnet. Not because they're brilliant masterminds, but because they understand one terrifying truth: the world doesn't notice people who blend in. That brings us to Jason Derek Brown, a man who looked more like a youth pastor or a surf shop owner than one of America's most wanted criminals. He had a tan, sun-bleached hair, a laid-back grin, and a voice that could sell anything. In another life, he could have been your neighbor, your co-worker, your daughter's soccer coach. But in reality, he was a con man, a fraudster, and eventually, a killer. His life before the murder was already murky. Born in California, fluent in French, and raised Mormon, Jason cultivated a clean image. But underneath, he was living on credit cards, forged checks, and stolen identities. He posed as a golf equipment rep, a luxury toy dealer, even a trust fund investor, all while staying just far enough ahead of his lies. He had filed for bankruptcy. He drove flashy cars he couldn't afford. And every time the pressure closed in, he disappeared just long enough to reset the narrative. But in November 2004, the stakes changed. Jason needed money, real money, and fast. That's when he learned about an armored truck delivery scheduled outside a movie theater in Phoenix, Arizona. On November 29, 2004, as the Brinks truck driver, 24-year-old Robert Keith Palomares exited the theater carrying a bag of over $56,000 in weekend deposits, Jason ambushed him. Surveillance cameras later showed Jason lurking near the exit on a bicycle, wearing a hooded sweatshirt and gloves. Without warning, he pulled a .45 caliber pistol and fired 5 rounds into Robert's head and torso at close range. He grabbed the bag and fled. The execution-style killing was fast, brutal, and efficient. Witnesses said Jason moved with calm precision, like someone who had rehearsed every second. But what shocked investigators even more was what came next. Jason didn't disappear into the shadows. He went clubbing that night. He checked into a hotel. He tried to lay low but left enough breadcrumbs that investigators quickly identified him as the shooter. Within days, the FBI tracked his SUV to a storage facility where they found a stash of ammunition, his passport, and the bicycle used in the getaway. But Jason was already gone. His last known sighting was a week later in Las Vegas, where he abandoned his car and fled on foot. And then, nothing, for years. The FBI believed Jason used his French fluency to flee to Canada or possibly Europe. Others claim to have spotted him in Salt Lake City, on a beach in Southern California, or even working in a ski resort. Tips poured in, over 800 of them, but none ever stuck. Jason knew how to disappear because he had never truly existed in one place to begin with. He was a master of social camouflage, able to reinvent his backstory, his faith, his face. The FBI added him to the 10 most wanted fugitives list in 2007, offering a $200,000 reward. But Jason stayed invisible. His siblings were questioned. One brother was charged with obstruction after helping Jason clean out his apartment post-murder. He served time, but Jason remained a ghost. What makes Jason Derek Brown's case so chilling is that it's not just about a murder. It's about a man who understood people, who could walk into your life, shake your hand, laugh with your children, and leave you robbed and ruined without ever raising suspicion. He didn't live in the shadows. He lived in charm. He didn't wear a mask. He wore confidence. And that's what makes catching him so difficult. Because Jason could be anywhere. The man next to you at the grocery store. The one asking for directions at the gas station. The friendly face you meet on vacation. He knows how to disappear not by hiding, but by blending. And that kind of fugitive doesn't make mistakes. He lets the world forget. But while Jason's face might fade from memory, The man he gunned down in front of a movie theater, a young father working a late shift, has never been forgotten. And for the FBI, Jason Derek Brown isn't a cold case. He's a reminder that the most dangerous people don't always run in the dark. Sometimes they smile as they vanish. And our next fugitive, she didn't vanish after a crime. She built her entire life on a vanishing act. A woman who stole a dead child's identity, hid in Texas for over a decade, and left behind a mystery so baffling that even in death, no one knows who she really was. Jason Derek Brown taught us that charm can be more dangerous than a gun. That a man who smiles at you, flirts with the clerk, and waves to the neighbor might also be the one who calmly puts a bullet in someone's head and disappears into the sun. But what if the fugitive doesn't kill with a weapon? What if she kills her past instead? Deletes it, burns it, buries it under layers of stolen names and forged papers until even the people who loved her never knew who they were holding. If Jason vanished into the world's shadows, the next fugitive made the world vanish around her. She wasn't a gunman. She was an illusion, a woman who stepped into East Texas under the name Lorie Ruff and died without ever revealing who she really was. For nearly 20 years, Lorie lived as a ghost wrapped in skin. She had a driver's license, a social security number, a car registered in her name. She got married, had a daughter, attended church, went to family barbecues. But no one knew who she was. Not really. Because Lorie Ruff didn't exist. The name she used belonged to a dead child from Pennsylvania, a girl who died in a fire decades earlier. That's where Lorie began, by digging through a list of deceased infants, selecting one whose death had gone mostly unrecorded, and applying for a duplicate birth certificate. With that single document, she launched her new life. From there, she obtained a new social security number, driver's license, and legally changed her name in Idaho before settling in Texas, all perfectly legal on paper, all built on a corpse. And she would have remained a phantom if not for her unraveling. In 2003, Lorie married a man named Blake Ruff, part of a well-known East Texas family. They were drawn to her soft-spoken nature, her Christian values, and her apparent independence. But questions began piling up quickly. She refused to let her in-laws see her childhood photos. She claimed to have no family, no parents, no siblings, no relatives at all. When asked about her upbringing, she grew defensive. When they pressed harder, she turned angry. She demanded privacy, even around her own child. She burned documents, hoarded mail, and installed multiple locks on her bedroom door, even within the safety of her own home. Her behavior slowly became erratic. She isolated herself, wrote strange, paranoid notes, accused Blake's family of spying on her, claimed people were following her. In 2010, after years of emotional distance and outbursts, Blake filed for divorce and was awarded full custody of their daughter. Lorie's world collapsed. 2 weeks later, on Christmas Eve, she parked her car in the driveway of her ex-in-law's home and shot herself in the head. The note she left behind didn't explain anything. No apology, no real farewell. Just a storm of rambling, disconnected sentences. That should have been the end of the story, but in reality, it was the beginning. As Blake sorted through her possessions, he found a lockbox buried deep in her closet. Inside was a horror movie and paperwork, documents from multiple states, receipts for cash-only motel stays under different names, references to aliases like Becky Sue Turner and Kimberly McLean, and pieces of evidence showing how she'd shifted identities again and again before settling on Lorie Ruff. No one, not her husband, not her daughter, not her church community, had known the real woman behind the smile. Her entire existence had been fabricated. But why? What was she running from? That question triggered an investigation involving local law enforcement, the FBI, the Social Security Administration, and eventually forensic genealogists. Her DNA was submitted to multiple databases. Facial recognition and family tree analysis began. Years passed. Then, in 2016, a break. Her real identity was uncovered. She had been born Kimberly Maria McLean in Pennsylvania in 1968. She had run away from home in her early 20s after a conflict with her family. The last thing she told her mother was, "You'll never see me again." And she kept that promise. From that moment, she became a fugitive, not from police, but from herself. What she was fleeing remains unclear. No criminal charges, no known abuse, no legal troubles on record. And yet, she buried her identity so deep that even in death, she nearly took the secret to the grave. Kimberly had crafted a new persona with more precision than most hackers or spies. She left almost no trail, and the only reason she was exposed at all was because her death forced open the box she had spent a lifetime locking. Her case is still studied today by identity theft experts, missing persons researchers, and forensic psychologists. Because she wasn't a killer, she wasn't a scammer, she was something else, a human ghost. A woman who existed among others, but never with them. A woman who lived in a house with her husband and child, but never once let them see the foundation beneath her. What makes Kimberly McLean, aka Lorie Ruff, so terrifying isn't that she ran from justice. It's that she lived in peace while hiding the truth in plain sight. That she was able to wear motherhood, marriage, and community like a costume. That no one, for decades, ever asked the right question at the right time. And even after the reveal, the why still hangs in the air. What happened to her in Pennsylvania that made her sever every tie to the life she was born into? What trauma pushed her to destroy her name, her family, her entire history? And what else, still hidden, died with her that Christmas Eve in Texas? Some fugitives run with blood on their hands, others run with silence in their lungs. But the next fugitive? He didn't run at all, not at first. He was escorted out of prison, unsupervised, given time to shop for clothes, and then simply never came back. Because the system trusted him. Because they thought he had changed. But Lester Eubanks hadn't changed at all. And the little girl he murdered never got the chance to grow up, while he got to walk away. Lorie Ruff showed us what it looks like when someone builds a life on a lie so complete that even death can't uncover the truth right away. But our next fugitive didn't just hide in the shadows. He was handed the keys to the door, trusted, supervised, escorted into freedom by the very system meant to keep him locked away. And when he walked out, he never came back. Lester Eubanks is perhaps one of the most horrifying reminders that evil doesn't always wear handcuffs forever. Sometimes it gets a day pass. And in Eubanks' case, the freedom he was given turned into a disappearance that would last over half a century. The crime he committed should have made him unforgettable and unfree forever. On November 14, 1965, in Mansfield, Ohio, 14-year-old Mary Ellen Diener walked into a laundromat just a few blocks from her home. It was early evening. She was polite, quiet, focused, but she never came back out. Later that night, her body was found behind the building, beaten, sexually assaulted, and shot twice. The murder shocked the entire town. It was brutal, predatory, and vicious. And just days later, Lester Eubanks, a 22-year-old local with a long criminal history, was arrested. His record already included attempted rape. He was a known predator, a violent one. And this time, the evidence was overwhelming. He confessed to the crime, told detectives how he approached Mary Ellen, tried to assault her, and when she resisted, shot her once. But when she didn't die, he walked away, then returned to shoot her again. It was an execution, a child's final moments dictated by a man who showed not even a flicker of hesitation. At his trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. The courtroom breathed a sigh of relief. It was 1966. Justice had been served, or so everyone thought. But over the next several years, the legal landscape shifted. The U.S. Supreme Court temporarily abolished the death penalty in 1972, and many death row inmates had their sentences commuted. including Eubanks. His sentence was changed to life in prison. It should have meant silence, permanence, that his face would be seen only through bars. But then came the unthinkable. In December 1973, Eubanks was granted a temporary release from prison to go Christmas shopping, alone, as part of a reward for good behavior. He was dropped off, unsupervised, in a shopping district in Columbus, Ohio, and told to return to the pickup point at 2 p.m. He never showed. At first, authorities assumed he'd gotten lost or delayed. But within hours, it was clear. He was gone. Not just gone, but vanished. No fingerprints, no sightings, no contacts. He had slipped away into America like a ghost. The question everyone asked was, how could this happen? How could a man convicted of the murder and sexual assault of a child be allowed to wander free, for any reason? The answer lies in the blind optimism of a broken era. At the time, Ohio prisons had adopted a progressive rehabilitation model which believed in trust building and the possibility of reform. Eubanks had been well behaved. He painted. He tutored other inmates. He played the part. And so they believed him. They gave him a day pass, and he used it to disappear for the next 5 decades. In the weeks after Lester Eubanks vanished from that holiday shopping trip, the prison system remained oddly calm, as if this was a mistake that could be fixed with a memo. At first, they quietly searched local areas, issued an internal bulletin, and downplayed the severity to avoid public backlash. But Eubanks didn't turn up. He hadn't just ducked out of sight. He had planned this. Investigators later discovered that he had likely been in contact with friends or family prior to his disappearance, coordinating his escape route before the day pass was ever granted. It wasn't a decision made on impulse. It was a long game. And he played it flawlessly. Weeks turned to months, months to years, and the silence around his case grew louder. Incredibly, for over 2 decades, Lester Eubanks was not even listed on the FBI's most wanted radar. His file drifted through hands. His paperwork sat untouched in filing cabinets. It wasn't until the 1990s that federal authorities realized Eubanks had slipped entirely off the grid. By then, the trail had gone cold. There were no credit card records, no license renewals, no digital fingerprints. And remember, this was the pre-internet era. If you had a new name, a good story, and just enough charisma, you could vanish into any American town and become someone else. Investigators feared that's exactly what Eubanks had done. The FBI reopened the case fully in the early 2000s, assigning a task force to review his past connections. They followed up on rumors that he had fled to Michigan, that he had passed through Georgia, that he was hiding in plain sight in California. In 2016, a major break came when U.S. Marshals tracked down a cousin of Eubanks in Los Angeles. The cousin confessed that Lester had stayed with him briefly in the mid-1990s under an alias, and that he had left abruptly when he feared someone recognized him. That tip reignited national attention. Composite sketches were updated. Age-progressed images were created. The FBI even aired Eubanks' story on America's Most Wanted and Netflix's Unsolved Mysteries, hoping that time and modern exposure would do what the old system failed to. And then came a chilling detail. Investigators discovered that Eubanks had applied for a job at a waterbed factory in California in the 1980s under a fake name and was hired. He worked there for years, got to know coworkers, was described as polite, quiet, hardworking, just another guy trying to make rent. But that was the real horror. He had blended in again, worked among families, children, ordinary people, and no one suspected a thing. The man who had executed a 14-year-old girl behind a laundromat was now assembling furniture, smiling in break rooms, chatting about the weather. And no one knew. That realization haunted agents. How many other jobs had he worked? How many neighborhoods had he lived in? How many times had someone almost called in a tip, only to dismiss the idea that a man that normal-looking could be a killer? In 2019, the FBI officially added Lester Eubanks to the 10 most wanted fugitives list, more than 45 years after his escape. A $50,000 reward was posted. His case became symbolic, not just of justice delayed, but of justice mishandled. Because Eubanks didn't escape with a gun. He didn't tunnel through a wall. He didn't bribe a guard. He was handed freedom, trusted with it, and he turned it into a lifetime of second chances that Mary Ellen Deaner never got. Her family, especially her sister, continued to push for answers. They had lived through the trial, the sentencing, the supposed resolution, only to watch as the man responsible for their sister's murder was allowed to walk through a department store at Christmas and vanish. That's what made this case so psychologically corrosive, because it wasn't just about what Lester Eubanks did in 1965. It was what the system allowed him to do in 1973, and what he chose to do every single day after that. Not turn himself in, not apologize, but live, move, breathe, age, and perhaps most disturbing of all, blend in so well that even now, as an elderly man in his 80s, he may be out there, sitting on a porch, walking through a church lobby, holding the door for strangers. Because Lester didn't just escape prison, he escaped memory. By the time Lester Eubanks made it onto the FBI's 10 most wanted list in 2019, he had already lived more life as a fugitive than he had as a prisoner. More years free than behind bars, more birthdays, more chances. He had outlived most of the officers who arrested him, outlived the original prosecutors, outlived nearly everyone except the family of Mary Ellen Deaner, the 14-year-old girl whose final moments were spent in unimaginable fear and pain, alone behind a laundromat, at the mercy of a man who was already known to be dangerous. The injustice didn't end with the murder. It metastasized afterward, into the courtroom, into the parole board's decision to reduce a death sentence to life, into the prison's decision to reward good behavior with a shopping trip, and worst of all, into silence. For decades, no one publicly admitted how badly the system had failed. Even after the FBI took over the case again, investigators ran into the same wall they'd been slamming against for years. Eubanks had left no digital footprint. He didn't use banks, didn't register vehicles, didn't leave a paper trail. He adapted, possibly changed his name again, possibly found under-the-table work in industries that never ran background checks. When asked how someone could live like that, invisibly, for decades, one agent answered simply, "You don't need a new face when you've already disappeared into the crowd." The tragedy of this case is not only that justice was denied, but that the denial was bureaucratic. It wasn't a brilliant escape, it was a permission slip. And Lester Eubanks exploited it with the kind of cold patience that predators rarely get to exercise. He didn't break out of prison, he strolled out. He didn't hide in a storm drain. He got a ride to a shopping center. He didn't risk anything, because the risk was never his. It belonged to the system, and it failed. The FBI continues to receive tips. Age-progressed photos have been circulated, and investigators believe that someone, somewhere, knows exactly where he is, or where he was until recently. Maybe he died in hiding, maybe he's still alive. But as of today, Lester Eubanks remains one of the most high-profile fugitives in American history, a convicted child killer who simply walked away. And if that leaves you with a pit in your stomach, it should. Because it wasn't the crime that made him unforgettable, it was the escape. The proof that even the worst among us can vanish, not in the dark, but in daylight, if we're not paying close enough attention. But while Eubanks' case is shaped by decades of silence, our next fugitive thrived in noise, social media, relationships, attention. She wasn't a ghost, she was a spark. And when her world started slipping from her hands, she didn't retreat. She reached for a weapon she didn't have the courage to use herself, and she handed it to someone else. Brenda Delgado was not a killer in the physical sense. She was a killer by proxy. A woman so consumed by jealousy, rejection, and the need to reclaim what she believed was hers, that she turned love into a hit list. And when the murder was done, when the life she helped destroy lay in a pool of blood outside an apartment in Dallas, Brenda crossed a border and disappeared. Lester Eubanks disappeared quietly, like a shadow that drifted out of view. Brenda Delgado, by contrast, made noise before she ever vanished. Her disappearance wasn't the end of her crime. It was just another chapter in a story already soaked in obsession, manipulation, and death by proxy. Because Brenda didn't pull the trigger herself. She didn't hold the weapon or stand at the scene. But the bullet was hers. The plan was hers. The motive was written in every deleted text, every envious look, every smile she gave before whispering someone else's name as the one who would carry out the killing. She didn't vanish after the fact. She vanished because she knew the whole thing had started with her. And when the time came, she ran. Brenda Delgado lived in Dallas, Texas. She was bright, articulate, well-educated, a dental hygiene student with a long-term boyfriend who was finishing his residency in dermatology. His name was Dr. Ricardo Ricky Paniagua. For a while they were inseparable, deeply in love, attending medical functions together, making plans for the future. But Ricky eventually ended the relationship, gently but firmly. And not long after, he met another woman, Dr. Kendra Hatcher, a beautiful, accomplished pediatric dentist. Their relationship blossomed quickly. They took weekend trips, posted photos, talked about marriage. But behind the scenes, Brenda was watching, not moving on, not healing, watching. And the more she watched, the more enraged she became. Friends later told investigators that Brenda couldn't stop talking about Ricky, how he had moved on too fast, how she had given him everything, how she deserved to be the one beside him. But what began as heartbreak metastasized into something colder. She began stalking Kendra online, tracking their every move. She looked at their Facebook check-ins, their photos, their friend lists. She kept detailed notes. She convinced herself she had been replaced, not just in love, but in identity. Ricky had chosen a better version of her. Brenda's grip on reality warped, and then came the planning. She recruited a man named Crystal Cortez, someone she barely knew, to serve as her driver. She told Crystal she was investigating an unfaithful boyfriend and needed help scaring the other woman. But in truth, she had already made contact with an ex-boyfriend named Christopher Love, a man with a criminal record and access to guns. Over the course of several days, Brenda orchestrated the details. Kendra's address, her parking schedule, the exact time she got home from work. Brenda gave Christopher a gun, gave Crystal a car, and gave the order. On September 2nd, 2015, Crystal and Christopher drove to Kendra's apartment in uptown Dallas. As Kendra pulled into her parking garage, Crystal blocked her car with their vehicle. Christopher exited, walked up to the driver's side, and shot Kendra in the head at close range. She died instantly. Her purse was stolen to make it look like a robbery, but the plan was far more personal. And when police began tracing the crime backwards, security footage, phone pings, witness statements, the trail didn't stop at Christopher or Crystal. It stopped at Brenda. She had tried to disappear into the background. She had deleted texts, wiped social media accounts, denied involvement. But investigators found everything: the messages, the payments, the motive. Jealousy wasn't just part of the story, it was the story. When police confronted her, Brenda gave them the performance of a lifetime. She said she was shocked, devastated, praying for Kendra's family. She sat still, kept her voice low, but her eyes gave her away. They didn't blink when they should have. They scanned the room. They calculated. She wasn't shocked. She was thinking, planning. And within days of being named a person of interest, Brenda vanished, just like that. A woman with no violent record, no prior arrests, no obvious history of flight. Gone. But Brenda hadn't fled randomly. She had been preparing. She used connections from her Mexican heritage, crossed the border into Nuevo León, and vanished into a country where extradition isn't always guaranteed, especially for capital crimes. For months, authorities searched. Tips trickled in. She had changed her appearance. She was using a fake name. She was possibly being sheltered by family. Brenda had gone from grieving ex-girlfriend to international fugitive, and the body she left behind was a woman she'd never even met. That's what made her so chilling. She didn't kill out of rage. She killed out of replacement. Kendra wasn't a rival. She was a mirror Brenda couldn't live with. And when she couldn't shatter that reflection, she decided to erase it. Entirely. But the truth, like most corpses, doesn't stay buried for long. Brenda Delgado didn't vanish in panic. She disappeared with intention. That's what chilled investigators the most. She didn't run blindly. She ran strategically. And she didn't run alone. She had help. After orchestrating the murder of Kendra Hatcher, Brenda had already prepared the path out of Dallas. She reached out to family contacts with ties to northern Mexico, used prearranged transportation to cross the border undetected, and found shelter in the city of Torreon, in the state of Coahuila. While police in Dallas scrambled to piece together the murder plot, Brenda was already far beyond their reach, surrounded by family members who either didn't know what she had done or didn't care. At first, law enforcement treated her as a missing person of interest, but within weeks, the digital evidence became impossible to ignore. Brenda's phone records placed her in communication with Christopher Love before and after the murder. Surveillance footage placed Crystal Cortez at the scene. Brenda had paid both of them, given them instructions, rehearsed the scenario like a play. There were no doubts left. Brenda was the director, and Kendra was cast as the casualty. And when authorities realized that Brenda had fled the country, everything changed. In April 2016, just months after the killing, Brenda Delgado was officially added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list. She was only the 9th woman in history to receive that designation, a title reserved for America's most dangerous and elusive criminals. The FBI placed her photo on posters across the US-Mexico border, pushed alerts to international law enforcement networks, and authorized a $100,000 reward for information leading to her arrest. But Brenda was slippery. She was soft-spoken, non-violent, intelligent, everything people don't associate with a killer. She didn't fit the stereotype. She didn't look the part. That's what made her dangerous. She had no criminal history, no addiction problems, no trail of violence. She was, by all appearances, a normal woman, grieving, studying, just another face in a crowded city. And once she crossed the border, she blended in. She dyed her hair, changed her style, wore oversized glasses. She used Spanish fluently, immersed herself in the rhythm of local life, and avoided tourist areas. It wasn't until the FBI's tip line received a call from a Mexican citizen, someone who had seen a news article and recognized her, that the net finally tightened. On April 8, 2016, Brenda Delgado was arrested in a modest apartment in Torreon. She didn't resist, didn't deny who she was. But when asked why she did it, she stayed silent. No apology, no explanation. Just that cold silence that follows people who believe they were entitled to something and couldn't stand to watch someone else have it. Her arrest raised difficult questions about extradition. Mexico has a long-standing policy against extraditing suspects who face the death penalty. Knowing this, prosecutors in Texas were forced to waive capital punishment to secure her return. They wanted justice more than they wanted vengeance. And so, Brenda was flown back to the United States under armed escort, charged with capital murder, and held without bail. In court, she wore prison khakis and a face drained of emotion. But those who watched her closely saw something else, not guilt, not sadness, but calculation. Brenda Delgado hadn't snapped, she had planned, and in many ways, her crime wasn't about love, it was about identity. Kendra Hatcher had stepped into a life Brenda believed still belonged to her, And when reality shattered that illusion, she didn't try to fix it. She decided to end it. Coldly, indirectly, permanently. That's what made Brenda terrifying. She didn't lash out. She outsourced. She didn't argue. She arranged. She weaponized others, used their desperation to do what she couldn't risk herself. And even as the walls closed in, even when the trial date was set and the prosecution began laying out her digital footprints, Brenda never once confessed. She claimed innocence, said she had no idea what Christopher Love had planned, that she hadn't meant for anyone to die, but the texts told a different story. So did the timing, the precision, the payments, and the look in her eyes every time someone said Kendra's name. There was no shock, just that faint, tight-lipped curl of someone who had already decided how this story should have ended, and didn't like that it hadn't gone according to script. And as the jury listened to testimony, as Kendra's friends described her bright spirit, her career, her future, the courtroom never once heard remorse from the woman who had set it all in motion. The courtroom where Brenda Delgado stood trial was silent, but not still. You could feel the weight in the air, not just from the crime, but from the way it was committed. A murder for hire has its own kind of evil. It's not spontaneous, it's not messy, it's not born from sudden rage. It's ordered, like a package. It's written in text messages, planned in calendar notes, executed through someone else's hands. And that's exactly what Brenda did. She didn't pull the trigger that ended Kendra Hatcher's life, but the gun was only the final piece in a plan she had crafted weeks before. As the trial unfolded, prosecutors laid out every detail. How Brenda tracked Kendra's movements. How she contacted Christopher Love, a known felon with gang ties, and convinced him to commit murder. How she paid Crystal Cortez to serve as the driver. How she had promised more money to both, money she never actually had. Because the killing wasn't just about eliminating a rival, it was about illusion. Brenda wanted to feel like she still had power, that she still mattered, that Ricky's new love was just a temporary problem with a permanent solution. And so she lied, and used, and killed, by chain reaction. Testimony after testimony revealed her manipulation, her ability to charm, to reframe the truth, to position herself as a victim even while pulling the strings. Crystal Cortez took a plea deal and testified against her. Christopher Love was sentenced to death. But Brenda, she remained composed, never angry, never outwardly cruel, just quiet, cold. She looked at witnesses like they were props in a play that had gone off script. Her defense team tried to paint her as emotionally disturbed, as a woman with abandonment trauma who had acted irrationally after losing someone she loved. But the jury didn't buy it. It wasn't emotion that killed Kendra Hatcher. It was obsession. It was planning. It was decision after decision, each one leading toward blood. Brenda Delgado was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. And as the verdict was read, she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just looked forward, like a woman who already knew how the story would end. Maybe she had accepted it, or maybe, in her mind, she had still won. Because Ricky never married Kendra. Because Kendra, the woman who had taken everything Brenda believed belonged to her, was gone. But that's what makes her case so terrifying. Not the act itself, but the lack of remorse, the vacancy behind the eyes, the careful decisions of someone who believed her pain justified someone else's death. Brenda didn't try to reclaim her life. She tried to erase someone else's. And when she lost control of the outcome, she ran, because control, for Brenda Delgado, was everything. Her story is often used as a cautionary tale of digital jealousy, emotional instability, and the way modern communication allows violence to be orchestrated with just a few taps. But it's more than that. It's about entitlement, about ownership, about a woman who believed love was something you could repossess, and when she couldn't, she tried to annihilate what replaced her. But if Brenda Delgado built her crime through others, our final fugitive did the unthinkable with his own bare hands. There were no accomplices, no gang members, no hired hitmen, just a man who once held a top security clearance, worked for the State Department, spoke 5 languages, and one night drove his family deep into the woods, slaughtered them, set their bodies on fire, and disappeared. William Bradford Bishop didn't kill out of desperation. He killed out of ego, out of failure, out of the unbearable thought that his life hadn't gone according to plan. And when he was done, he vanished. And all these years later, no one has found him. Brenda Delgado orchestrated her crime from the shadows, pulling strings with the precision of a director behind the curtain. But William Bradford Bishop wasn't content to delegate his violence. He didn't whisper instructions or send coded messages. He looked his victims in the face, he stood over them, and he did it all by himself. What makes Bishop's case so disturbing isn't just the brutality of what he did, it's how seamlessly it came from a man who, by every public metric, had achieved the American ideal. He was brilliant, polished, dignified. He spoke 5 languages, held a master's degree from Yale, and worked for the U.S. State Department in high-level foreign service roles. He had lived in Ethiopia, Italy, and South Africa. He knew politics, diplomacy, psychology. He wore suits tailored to his posture and had the kind of calm demeanor that made people lean in when he spoke. To the outside world, he was the perfect husband, the intellectual father, the man with a golden path ahead of him. But that's the thing about perfection. Sometimes it's armor. Sometimes it hides rot. And for William Bradford Bishop, the rot was ego. By early 1976, Bishop was in his late 30s, living in Bethesda, Maryland, with his wife Annette, his 3 sons aged 5, 10, and 14, and his 68-year-old mother Lobelia. It was a household of stability, with framed certificates on the walls and weekend tennis matches on the calendar. But inside Bishop's mind, things were unraveling. He had just been passed over for a promotion at the State Department, a decision he saw not as professional feedback, but as a personal betrayal. He began to spiral. Friends later described him as withdrawn, moody, volatile. He complained constantly about money, prestige, how his co-workers didn't understand his intellect. He had begun seeing a psychiatrist. He was taking anti-anxiety medication. But the problem wasn't his nerves. It was his identity. William Bradford Bishop believed he was entitled to more recognition, more power, more respect. And when the world didn't hand it to him, something inside him snapped. On March 1, 1976, Bishop left work early. He went to the bank, withdrew several $100s, and drove to a Montgomery Ward store to buy a small sledgehammer and a shovel. Then he stopped at a gas station and filled a metal can with gasoline. When he returned home that evening, his family was preparing dinner. What happened next was not an explosion of rage. It was a quiet, systematic massacre. Bishop walked into the house and bludgeoned his wife Annette with the sledgehammer. Then he moved to the next room and did the same to his mother. Then to each of his 3 sons, methodically, one by one, as if he were crossing items off a list. There was no sign of struggle. No one screamed. There were no neighbors reporting loud noises, just a home that fell silent, room by room, under the weight of a man who had decided to erase his entire bloodline. When it was over, Bishop dragged the bodies into the garage, wrapped them in blankets and trash bags, loaded them into the family's maroon station wagon, and drove over 275 miles south to a wooded area near Columbia, North Carolina. There, in a shallow hole carved with the shovel he had just purchased, he placed the bodies side by side. Then he poured gasoline over them and lit a match. The bodies burned. The life he had built, the family photos, the PTA meetings, the quiet dinners, turned to smoke in a forest that didn't know their names. But Bishop wasn't done. He drove the car another few miles, ditched it in the woods, and vanished. For over a week, no one noticed. Bishop had told his office he was sick. The neighbors assumed the family had gone on vacation. It wasn't until a State Department colleague reported his absence that a welfare check was performed. Inside the home, investigators found blood. So much blood it pooled beneath the rugs, smears on the walls, evidence of cleanup attempts that had stopped midway through. But there were no bodies. Just the smell of iron and bleach, and a silence so heavy it felt loud. Then the news came in. A park ranger in North Carolina had discovered the burned remains of a family of 5. Dental records confirmed it. It was the Bishops, all of them, except William. The manhunt began immediately. But Bishop was a professional traveler, a man who had lived under diplomatic protection in multiple countries, fluent in languages, trained in counterintelligence methods. He knew how to forge documents. He knew how to disappear. Airports were watched. Borders were alerted. But there was no trace, no plane ticket, no credit card trail. It was as if he had stepped out of his own body and into someone else's. He was listed as one of the FBI's most wanted for decades. Age-progressed images were released. Tips poured in from Europe, Italy, Switzerland, even Sweden. But none were confirmed. Some claimed he had undergone plastic surgery. Others believed he had taken his own life in some remote part of the world. But investigators never found a body. And that, more than anything, kept the case alive. Because a man like William Bradford Bishop didn't die in obscurity. He didn't vanish by accident. He planned this. And somewhere out there, maybe in a quiet coastal village, maybe in the back room of a bookstore, maybe sipping coffee while watching the world forget, the man who murdered his entire family may still be breathing. The search for William Bradford Bishop became one of the most enduring and confounding fugitive hunts in U.S. history. From the moment authorities realized he had slipped out of Maryland undetected, they knew this wasn't a typical escape. Bishop was a man who understood borders, surveillance gaps, and the psychology of pursuit. He had worked in U.S. embassies. He had read case files. He knew what investigators would look for, and more importantly, what they wouldn't. His car, found in North Carolina, yielded no useful fingerprints, no blood. No signs of where he'd gone next. It was as if he had burned his family, dropped the match, and vanished into smoke. The FBI believed he had fled overseas almost immediately. Why? Because Bishop didn't just have a passport. He had diplomatic knowledge, foreign contacts, and fluency in multiple European languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Serbo-Croatian. He could slip into a culture with ease. He could blend in with travelers, live in hostels, find under-the-table jobs, forge documents in countries where paper records still ruled. In the late 1970s, a tip came from Italy. A man matching Bishop's description was spotted in a train station in Sorrento, traveling alone, speaking fluent Italian, and paying in cash. The tip seemed credible. Bishop had lived in Italy during his service, and some believed he may have returned there using old connections. Years later, a woman in Sweden swore she served him coffee at a small countryside inn. He introduced himself under another name, but when she saw his face years later on a most wanted poster, she froze. The man had aged, yes, but the eyes were unmistakable. Again, investigators followed the lead. Again, it led nowhere. There were more sightings. Lausanne, Switzerland. A bookstore employee claimed a customer had purchased English-language newspapers and carried himself with refined American formality. In Brussels, a man used Bishop's known alias to check into a small hotel, but left early the next morning, leaving no record of his exit. In each case, the tip ended just short of confirmation. But the consistency painted a chilling possibility that Bishop hadn't just vanished, he had relocated, that he had created a second life, one quiet and cultivated, free of family ties but surrounded by books, languages, and a new identity. This idea haunted FBI profilers who began to reconstruct who Bishop might be now. He wasn't a drifter. He wouldn't be in the shadows. He would be near libraries, universities, expat communities. He would be clean, quiet, maybe even respected. They believed he would still be drawn to intellectual environments, perhaps posing as a retired professor, a translator, a consultant, a man who read the paper every morning and corrected grammar in conversation. But underneath that polished veneer would still live the same cold, narcissistic entitlement that made him believe his family's lives were his to erase. In 2014, nearly 4 decades after the murders, the FBI took the rare step of exhuming the remains of an unidentified man buried in Alabama who bore a strong resemblance to Bishop. DNA testing confirmed it wasn't him. It was a dead end, but it reignited public interest. In 2016, he was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted list, making it clear that agents believed Bishop could still be alive. He would be in his late 80s now, gray-haired, stooped, maybe a little slower, but still mentally sharp. They released age-progressed renderings of what he might look like. They revisited family members. They reprocessed crime scene evidence. And through it all, they tried to understand not just where he might be, but why he did it. FBI behavioral analysts describe Bishop as a high-functioning narcissist, someone whose identity was built on accomplishment, reputation, and control. He had spent his life carefully constructing the image of an educated diplomat, a man who deserved to be admired. But when that image cracked, when promotions slipped away, when his career plateaued, when financial pressures mounted, he didn't adjust. He collapsed inward. And he didn't just kill his family to escape a failing life. He killed them because, to him, they were extensions of his own ego. And once that ego was wounded beyond repair, everything attached to it had to go. His wife, his mother, his children, not as people, but as parts of a story he could no longer tolerate. That's why he didn't shoot them or stab them. He bludgeoned them with a sledgehammer, one by one. That level of violence isn't just lethal, it's intimate. It's rage that has been waiting. It's entitlement that has curdled into annihilation. And then he calmly buried them, burned them, cleaned up, and walked away. The emotional aftermath was brutal. The surviving family members, cousins, uncles, nieces, spent decades in limbo. Not just grieving the murders, but haunted by the idea that Bishop might still be out there. That he might be living in peace, while the children he murdered never had a chance to become men. That he might be sitting in a cafe, sipping espresso, while Annette's sister still sets a table for one too few every holiday. The FBI believes Bishop may still be alive. They believe he may have changed his name, started over, even married again. And what chills them the most is that if you passed him on the street today, you'd probably never notice. He's not wild-eyed. He's not hiding in a cave. He's cultured, controlled, and devastatingly intelligent. And he knows exactly how to go unseen. The most disturbing thing about William Bradford Bishop isn't just that he killed 5 people. It's that he may have spent the rest of his life living among us. Quietly, elegantly, unbothered. Unlike the usual fugitive who hides in desperation, Bishop had the means and mindset to live in full view. He likely didn't sleep in basements or forge survival in tents. He probably lived in modest but dignified housing, read foreign newspapers, paid in cash, and never drew attention to himself. Over the decades, the FBI chased ghosts, tips from retired expats in Portugal, old professors in Greece, a tourist in Switzerland who swore she saw a man speaking perfect American accented French while buying stamps at a post office. Each time, hope surged. Each time, it collapsed. And every time the public forgot, another anniversary would pass. The crime scene photos would re-emerge. The age-progressed sketches would be pinned to new corkboards in newer field offices. And yet, nothing. No body. No arrest. Just a trail of possibilities. That is the terrifying part. That a man who stood over his sons with a sledgehammer, who burned the woman who raised him, who drove hundreds of miles to bury the evidence of his identity, could still be alive, unpunished, decades later. His case became a lesson in how dangerous charm and intellect can be when weaponized by narcissism. Bishop's ability to function within elite diplomatic circles masked something darker, an internal fragility so severe that when his self-image cracked, he destroyed everything tethered to it. It wasn't just a collapse, it was a purge. He didn't just want to leave his life behind. He wanted to obliterate every person who reminded him of who he had been. And once it was done, he didn't spiral. He simply walked away. The FBI continues to keep the file open. They believe Bishop may have died anonymously in Europe, a man whose body now lies in an unmarked grave under a false name. Or they believe he may still be alive, nearly 90, perhaps living in a nursing home, blending in among others who no longer ask questions. What they don't believe is that he was ever sorry. Psychologists say fugitives like Bishop compartmentalize. They don't deny the act. They rationalize it, convince themselves it was necessary, even noble. The rage that once ignited the murder fades into a story they rewrite to preserve their own narrative. And that's why Bishop remains so terrifying. Not because he vanished, but because he likely vanished with peace. Because every time we revisit his case, there's still no closure. Just the image of a once polished man with blood on his hands and time on his side. And he is not the only one, because for every fugitive like Bishop who disappears beneath foreign skies, there are others, men and women who kill, run, and then wait, in plain sight, across borders, behind borrowed names and polite smiles. Some are caught, some are not, but all of them, every last one, prove the same chilling truth, that the most dangerous criminals are not always the loudest, or the most violent, or the ones with long rap sheets. Sometimes they are the ones who knew exactly what they were doing and walked away as if they hadn't done it at all. They don't always run with a bag of cash and a bleeding wound. Sometimes they pack neatly, lock the front door, say goodbye to the life they just destroyed, and vanish. The word fugitive used to conjure images of men in tattered clothes dodging dogs through the woods, sweaty, frantic, always on the edge of capture. But the fugitives in these stories aren't living in shadows. They live in mirrors, airports, sidewalk cafes. Some of them wore wedding rings when they killed. Some kissed their children goodnight before doing the unthinkable. Some were decorated, educated, trusted. Others were mothers, wives, caretakers, the very roles society tells us to trust without question. But all of them made the same choice: to kill, to leave, and to never look back. What makes these cases unbearable is not just the blood spilled, but the silence afterward, the not knowing, the eternal waiting of families who stare at the front door even when logic tells them no one's coming, the voicemail boxes that still get checked, the birthdays that still hurt. These fugitives didn't just break laws, they shattered time. They created grief loops that never end. And in doing so, they became more than criminals. They became absences that haunt everything around them. We like to believe fugitives live hard lives, that they suffer, that they never sleep, that karma finds them eventually. But the truth is far colder. Some live well, some adaptations, some disappear into new roles, new faces, new passports. And if they're careful, they become invisible not through stealth, but through normalcy. That's the scariest part, that you could pass them on the street, that the man reading the paper beside you, the woman sipping her tea in the library, the elderly neighbor who always smiles but never talks too much, could be someone who once buried a body, changed their name, and never looked back. Justice in these cases becomes a prayer more than a process. Because when years turn into decades, the law loses its grip, and all that's left is memory, pain, and suspicion. Somewhere out there, in a world full of cameras, satellites, and facial recognition, are people who have still managed to stay missing. Not by hiding under beds or fleeing to islands, but by becoming something else entirely. And that is what should keep us awake. Because fugitives aren't ghosts. They're not legends. They're not myths. They're real people. And some of them, the most dangerous ones, have learned how to vanish without ever leaving.